I have some people who are part of the community on this channel, and myself as well, over 30 and master cyclists. Do you recommend? I mean, each athlete is different, unique, right? But in a general recommendation, do you think it's more beneficial for a master's athlete to do a polarized training plan? Again, I've done both. They worked. I found personally I did enjoy polarized more just because I wasn't completely like in the hurt locker and pulling myself up from the floor. And I was also able to sneak in rides with friends. And I think that social aspect of cycling is important if people want to just go ride 100 miles
Totally.
just for fun, you know?
Totally.
So I'm curious, like, what would you recommend people start with who are masters cyclists specifically? Would you say polarized or kind of the traditional sweet spot?
So I think it's easy to, well, I guess I'll go back to what I was saying before. Like, what are the parameters? So if you think about age, so since we're
Yeah.
focusing on age, that is a parameter. That is and it will affect your training. It will affect what you're able to do. So while 30, I wouldn't necessarily say is old, so you might not feel the impact of recovery quite yet. You're probably getting close, but I think more than anything, when you're in that 30 range, you start actually having a professional life to juggle, and you might have a family that you need to juggle as well. And that tends to actually affect your recovery, not age. However, eventually age is a piece that comes into play. And when that is totally independent of the individual. I've got 70-year-old athletes where we really haven't needed to change their training that much because age hasn't really crept up on them quite in the same way. Then I have other athletes where it does. And then it's a big parameter that has to be adjusted to. And then recovery is the key thing. It's not always necessarily what you're doing, it's more how you're recovering from it. So you might need an extra day of recovery. So, if you have a 6 to 8 hour work week, or sorry, 6 to 8 hour training week that you're able to operate around, that may not be really worthwhile to push to 8 and instead just give you that extra day of recovery. But one thing I will say on age that is important to look at is, high intensity training. The nice side of VO2 efforts is that it focuses on high force, which goes into, skeletal system, muscle system. It pulls from a lot of that, which is something that males and females lose a very high percentage per year post basically 30 years old. I think it might even be earlier than that if we do not incorporate it at all. And muscle mass, bone density, I mean, it all comes into that where we lose it if we don't use it. And it's almost impossible to get ahead of that loss or recoup that loss.
Yeah.
So it goes down to that's when high intensity training is important to have in your system for longevity. But that can also be accomplished in the gym and off the bike. And it might actually serve you better to do so. So I think that's kind of when, even if you have an athlete that responds really well to more of like a traditional approach where you do more of a block of steady base miles or a tempo block or sweet spot or threshold, it can be worthwhile to really incorporate that strength training into their training, especially with older individuals, so that they can retain that muscle mass, that skeletal system strength, so that they can hold on to that for longer term. So I think as I work with more older athletes, or when I work with those older athletes, that is something that I'm leaning hard on, is like, hey, it might actually be worth you riding a little bit less so we can bring this in. So then
Right.
going back to your question of like what like basically periodization approach would be best. I don't know if it really works that way. And I think it's more, again, what works for that individual and what they respond best to. Cause like Calvin, for you, for example, you've kind of learned, hey, you kind of enjoy more of a periodized approach a little bit better, kind of matches your lifestyle a little bit better. But then there's, hey, well, do you respond best to it? Is it something that actually you achieve your best fitness and form and best strength from that system, or is it
That's a
something
good
else?
point.
And I think that's another thing to really sort out. And if you work with a good coach, they're going to do that, and they're not going to just be, hey, there's only one way or one path or one direction. And I think that's the biggest thing. So as far as age goes, it just means really keeping a better eye on recovery, and then also keeping in mind long-term health, because that is something that does unfortunately degrade over time if you don't focus on it.
Mention weightlifting. Does trail running count? Because I don't have a gym membership personally, so if somebody's listening, I do trail run sometimes.
So yes and no. So if we focus on the concept of like bone density and or small muscle groups or activation and just general movement and full body health, trail running is phenomenal. You hit stabilizers, you have bone density increase, and cyclists. So people know, cyclists is notorious for, because we do not put strain or stress or weight on our bones while we're doing this sport. It is a big problem. In pro athletes, they really have to focus on this, which is, there is literally points to where your bones are starting to degrade due to this, and it's a health issue. So um, trail running, for example, is a great way of helping with this. And it's also a nice way because you're still working your aerobic system. So your endurance, which we're going to talk about zone 2 training in a bit, is being worked from trail running. So it's a good thing to bring into the mix, especially in maybe the off season or in base season when maybe you want to like bring your volume up, but not just through the bike. So it's a good example. I would still encourage athletes who don't lift, even who don't have access to a gym, to do some plyo work. So jump up and down your stairs, do stair repeats, do jump squats in your living room, do you could do really anything, jump like
Calisthenics
lunges, you
work?
could do, yeah, exactly. And
Okay.
all that stuff is going to help. It is good to, if you really are trying to build strength, so that goes back to holding on to muscle. You're going to need to lift heavy from time to time. But as far as health, um, injury prevention, long term scope, that's all going to be good to do plyo or, and that could be, yoga does help with that, but any sort of jump and explosive movement is going to be a little bit better served.